Welcome to the History in Focus channel. Be sure to subscribe so you don't miss more videos like this one.
The German airship L-49 was a weapon of war, a gigantic Zeppelin used to bomb cities during World War I. In October of 1917, it got lost in a storm and came down nearly intact on French soil. The crew tried to destroy the craft before capture, but failed. It was a gold mine for the Allies. For the first time, they had a complete modern Zeppelin to study. They copied the German engineering and built their own airships after the war. A navigation error handed over years of secret technology. In 1898, at the Courthouse Square in Prescott, Arizona, Fleming Parker, known as Jim, was publicly executed before a crowd. He had been convicted after a train robbery that ended with a victim. Public executions were still treated as events in the Wild West, drawing curious onlookers and entire families. The image shows how justice, public warning, and spectacle blended in an era of harsh laws and exposed punishments. Victorian children's portraits often look unsettling today. The rigid poses, the long camera exposure, and the wear of time left faces serious and nearly motionless. In an era of high infant mortality, many families valued each portrait as a rare keepsake. The images do not need to show anything supernatural to impress. The blank stares and the old silence of photography are enough to create that eerie atmosphere. The photo is called Guanajuato, Mexico, 1957, and it is by photographer Elliot Erwitt. It shows two visitors chatting casually inside the Guanajuato Mummy Museum, surrounded by dried bodies displayed standing upright. The mummies there were not prepared on purpose. They appeared by accident when bodies from a local cemetery were exhumed, and it was discovered that the soil had naturally mummified everything. When the family could not pay the burial fee, the body ended up on display. The museum still exists today. The Martyrdom Parade is a series of photos taken in 1940 by photographer Enrique Diaz in the town of San Juan de los Lagos, Mexico. The images show religious pilgrims submitting to extreme sacrifices as penance, walking on their knees for miles, carrying crosses and chains, wounding themselves as a way to pay promises and atone for sins. Popular Mexican Catholicism took faith into the flesh in a way that shocks outsiders. For those who took part, the pain was not punishment, it was the path itself to the sacred. The military hospital in Kiev between 1914 and 1918 during World War I. The Russian Empire sent millions of soldiers into the conflict and received a vast number of wounded in return. Improvised hospitals had to deal with injuries caused by artillery, machine guns, and new war technologies. Meanwhile, the empire itself was weakening from within. A few years later, Tsarist Russia would cease to exist. The armored vehicle in the photo is the Czech Skoda PA2, nicknamed Zelva, which means turtle. You can see why. The vehicle was entirely rounded, curved on all sides, specifically so bullets would ricochet instead of piercing the armor. It was built in the 1920s and had two driving positions, front and rear, so it did not need to turn around to reverse. It looked like science fiction. Very few units were ever made, and the strange appearance earned the Zelva a spot among the strangest military vehicles ever built. Two children appear holding hands on a road, but the faces are blurred. The effect looks frightening, but it is technical. During the long exposure, any movement could distort the image. What was probably just a photographic defect ended up becoming an unsettling-looking scene. It is a good example of how old camera limitations created results that today look like something out of a mystery story. Long before Photoshop, people were already manufacturing ghosts in photos. In the second half of the 19th century, photographers like the American William Mumler sold images where transparent figures appeared beside the living, supposedly the spirits of deceased relatives. It was pure technique, double exposure on the same plate. But at the height of spiritualism, grieving people paid dearly believing they were seeing their lost ones again. Mumler was even prosecuted for fraud. The trick was old. The longing to see the departed again never gets old. The hidden mother photo is one of the most bizarre traditions of the Victorian era. Since the camera needed several seconds of stillness to capture the image, and no baby stays still, someone needed to hold the child steady. That was where the mother came in, seated with the child on her lap, but covered by a cloth, a curtain, or even disguised as an armchair. In the final photo, the baby appears sharp and the mother becomes a ghostly shape in the background, holding her own child without being allowed to appear. Tenderness and strangeness in the same portrait. One of the luxury rooms of the Titanic shows why the ship was described as a floating palace. The first-class suites had elegant furniture, a fireplace, a private bathroom, and details worthy of an expensive hotel. The image reveals the level of comfort offered to the wealthiest passengers. At the same time, the history of the ship reminds us that luxury and technology were not an absolute guarantee of safety. Commander Richard Byrd was one of the great names of American aviation and polar exploration. In 1929, he led the first flight over the South Pole, a difficult feat for the technology of the time. Before that, he claimed to have flown over the North Pole in 1926, but that achievement is still debated by historians. The photo represents both the public heroism and the doubts that surround some great feats. The man serving tea to the lion is Alfred Hitchcock, the master of suspense. The photo is a publicity stunt. The lion is Leo, the roaring mascot that opens MGM films. Putting Hollywood's most sinister director in a domestic and absurd scene, serving tea to a real beast, was exactly the kind of humor Hitchcock loved. Behind the camera, he terrified audiences worldwide. In front of it, he liked to play the straight-faced clown, always with that impassive expression. The contrast was part of the character he built of himself. Wedding of Arthur Oxford and Georgina Wright at a London church. Weddings were one of the few occasions when the entire family gathered before the camera, wearing the best they had. For many people, it was the most polished portrait they would ever have in their entire lives. The man in the hood is Igor Gouzenko. In 1945, he worked with ciphers at the Soviet embassy in Canada when he defected and handed over documents about an espionage network. The revelation helped intensify the climate that would lead to the Cold War. For safety, Gouzenko began appearing in public with his face covered as in this 1954 interview. The mask became part of his story. Dentistry in 19th century Russia was basically pulling teeth, and barely even that. There was no decent anesthesia, no electric drill, no hygienic clinic. The dentist, when he was actually a real dentist and not the barber on the corner, used pliers and brute force. The patient held back the scream as best they could. A cavity became torture, and losing teeth early was the common fate of nearly everyone. When you look at these photos, remember that each of those mouths went through something that today we cannot even imagine without shuddering. The Little Ease was one of the cruelest cells in the Tower of London. The name, something like Little Comfort, was ironic. The cubicle was so tight that the prisoner could not stand or lie down, only crouch in the dark for days. The torture was the body itself without needing an executioner. Relax. This man is not holding a real head, and the woman beside him has not lost her own. The scene is part of Victorian trick photography, a type of image that became popular in the late 19th century, long before any editing software. Photographers were already creating illusions using double exposure, cutouts, and negative assembly. The results were impossible portraits, headless people, heads and hands, and scenes that looked like they came from an elegant nightmare. It was dark humor made with chemistry, patience, and a lot of creativity. Postmortem photography existed in the 19th century and looks somber today, but it had an emotional logic. Since taking a photo was expensive and rare, many families could only capture someone after the loss. In some portraits, the person was positioned as if sleeping or seated among relatives. The image served as a final keepsake, stored for years. More than shock, it reveals an attempt to preserve memory in a time without abundant photographs. The hurricane that hit Galveston in 1915 carried a heavy memory. 15 years earlier, the city had already endured one of the greatest natural disasters in United States history. After that, Galveston erected a concrete seawall along the shore and raised parts of the urban terrain. In 1915, the work was put to the test. The images showed damage, but they also reveal how engineering helped reduce the impact of a new storm. In December of 1983, Pope John Paul II visited Mehmet Ali Agca in Rebibbia prison in Rome. 2 years earlier, Aga had attempted to assassinate the Pope in St. Peter's Square. In the cell, the two spoke in low voices for several minutes, and the Pope forgave him personally. The image became one of the most powerful gestures of forgiveness of the 20th century. The photo was taken on the morning of April 15, 1912, by a steward on the German ship Prince Adalbert and shows an iceberg. The ship passed near the area where the Titanic had sunk hours before, and a reddish mark at the base of the ice drew attention. It was never proven to be the same iceberg. Even so, the image became famous precisely for feeding that historical doubt. In 1955, the acrobats Benny and Betty Fox danced atop a building in Chicago on a small wooden disc with no protection, with the city dozens of stories below their feet. Benny Fox became famous for exactly this. He would climb skyscrapers and dance on the edge to draw crowds down below. It was advertising, it was spectacle, and it was a way of making a living by flirting with death at every performance. One wrong step, and there was no second chance. The audience stood in the street with necks craned, cheering, and scared at the same time. The photo shows Pablo Escobar posing with his son in front of the White House in Washington during a trip in 1981. At the time, he was not yet publicly treated as one of the most wanted criminals in the world. Years later, his image would be linked to the peak of Colombian drug trafficking and the international manhunt. The contrast between the tourist photo and the future that would follow is what makes the scene so striking. The photo is from 1864 and shows Japanese samurai posing before the Great Sphinx in Egypt. They were part of a diplomatic mission sent by Japan to Europe and stopped in Egypt on the way. The visual shock is enormous. Japan had lived for centuries, nearly closed to the world, and there stood warriors in kimonos with 2 swords at their waist, before a monument more than 4,000 years old. A few years later, the world of the samurai itself would disappear, swept away by modernization. The photo captured an era about to end. The so-called hairy family of Burma had a rare genetic condition, hypertrichosis, which covers the entire body in long, fine hair. It started with a man in the Burmese king's court at the beginning of the 19th century and passed from generation to generation. By the end of the century, descendants of the family were exhibited as attractions in Europe and the United States, treated as circus curiosities. Behind the spectacle were ordinary people with a mutation that the science of the time barely understood and that audiences paid to stare at. The 1938 photo shows the Welsh medium Colin Evans apparently floating during a séance in London. The most likely explanation is simple. The camera was triggered at the instant he jumped from the chair in the dark, creating the illusion of levitation. In an era of great interest in spiritualism, images like this fueled beliefs, debates, and suspicions. In August of 1906, an attack struck the residence of Russian Prime Minister Pyotr Stolypin during a reception. The episode left several victims and reinforced the climate of political tension in the Russian Empire. Stolypin survived and became even more associated with repression against revolutionary groups. Years later, in 1911, he would also be assassinated in an opera house. The image records an era when Russian politics was heading toward an ever-deepening crisis. This man is Alphonse Bertillon, the Frenchman who essentially invented modern criminal identification. In the late 19th century, he created a system that measured prisoners' bodies, arm length, ear shape, skull size, believing no 2 people had exactly the same measurements. He also standardized the front and profile photo, the famous mugshot that exists to this day. The measurement system was eventually replaced by fingerprinting, which was more reliable. But the identification photo he created never went out of style. A 1945 military parade in Mongolia, the small steppe country wedged between the Soviet Union and China. That year, Mongolia entered the war on the Soviet side against Japan, and the end of the conflict became cause for a parade. Soldiers march in lockstep before a tribune of authorities in an open field surrounded by mountains. It is the image of a deeply rural country being dragged into the war machine of the 20th century. A few months later, Mongolia would confirm its definitive independence from China in a plebiscite. A crowd watches a British airship over the port of Ostend, Belgium in 1914 at the start of World War I. Seeing a machine of that size floating was enough to stop the city. Few imagined that airships and airplanes would soon go from technological marvels to military tools. The image captures the wonder of an audience before a novelty that would change warfare. In the cheapest lodging houses of Victorian England, sleeping could mean simply leaning against a rope stretched at chest height. Those who paid a bit more got a wooden box to lie in. The images remind us how harsh urban poverty was, and how rest, for many people, was treated almost as a commodity. Today it seems strange, but in that context it was an improvised solution for those who had nowhere to spend the night. The photo shows the Michelin band playing at the premiere of a brand radio program in April of 1928. The musicians were dressed as Bibendum, the chubby character made of tires, the Michelin mascot since 1898, and one of the oldest brand characters in the world. An entire band dressed as tires on the radio was pure advertising. In an era when companies were discovering the power of that new device inside people's homes. A fun detail, the mascot, white today, was originally dark in the earliest illustrations, the color of raw rubber. On April 18, 1906, San Francisco was hit by a major earthquake before dawn. The tremor itself was devastating, but the fires that followed turned entire neighborhoods to ruins. The photos show the city engulfed in smoke and then in rubble. Firefighters went so far as to dynamite buildings to try to contain the flames, but it did not always help. It was one of the greatest urban disasters in United States history. The crowd of children in Mickey Mouse masks belongs to one of the first Mickey Mouse Club gatherings in California, around 1930. Before this TV show, the club functioned as a Saturday cinema event. The kids watched cartoons and received masks of the character. In large numbers and in black and white, the scene looks curious and a bit odd to today's eyes. The images show children posing with small primates, something that feels unsettling today. In other eras, exotic animals appeared in family portraits, public attractions, and private collections, often treated as curiosities. What seemed like just a fun souvenir also reveals the different relationship people had with animals and entertainment. Today, the scene stands out precisely because it shows a custom that would not be viewed the same way. A street dentist scene in China, probably during the warlord era, between 1912 and 1928. There was no office, no anesthesia, no diploma. The man would set up a tent on the sidewalk, display necklaces made of pulled teeth as advertising for his services, and work right there in the middle of the street with pliers and brute strength. Anyone with a toothache did not have many choices. Either face that, or live with the pain until the tooth fell out on its own. China was torn apart by rival generals, and dental care was a luxury almost nobody could afford. An old masquerade party with costumes made of papier-mâché and fabric that look unsettling today. At the time, those outfits were part of balls, plays, and celebrations. The black and white, dim lighting, and rigid poses transformed the scene into something almost too theatrical. What was once fun and disguise ended up looking like mystery. The daguerreotype arrived in 1839, and suddenly it became possible to freeze a face forever. The people photographed between 1840 and 1850 are the oldest generation that exists in images, people born in the 18th century, some around 1750. When you look at those faces, you are literally seeing the farthest point photography reaches back in time. Before them, nobody else has a face, only a name and a record, or at most, a painted portrait. This photo shows a carriage workshop in Haddenham, England, around 1903. The boys among the adults were not there on a visit. They were apprentices. Back then, 12 or 13-year-old children already entered the trade, sweeping floors and learning the craft the hard way, years before receiving a real wage. That was how an artisan was made. The sad detail is the timing. The workshop made carriages just as the automobile was starting to appear. Those apprentices were mastering a profession that was going to vanish right before their eyes. A circus performer appears inside a tank car with crocodiles in Berlin, 1933. Circuses thrived on increasingly impressive acts to attract audiences, and sharing space with dangerous reptiles drew immediate attention. The image blends spectacle, controlled risk, and visual publicity, exactly the kind of scene that packed tents and became a curious photograph. German prisoners of war in 1945 watched footage of the Nazi concentration camps. The screening was part of the denazification process conducted by the Allies, confronting captured soldiers with the consequences of the regime they had served. The photo is heavy but important. It shows the moment many were forced to face what they claimed to have known nothing about. Freddie McIntosh, 8 years old, wore that outfit because his skin was extremely sensitive to daylight due to a rare condition. For children with that kind of sensitivity, going out in the sun requires careful protection. The outfit draws attention because it turns a medical necessity into an image that looks almost like an astronaut on the street. A woman inside a light bath at the Institute of Light Cure in London around 1900. The device surrounded the body with lamps, and it was believed the heat cured everything from rheumatism to depression. It was considered cutting-edge science and became the grandfather of tanning booths. The knife thrower Senior Arcturus and his assistant Miss Rose Arcturus around 1900. The act was simple and terrifying. She stood against the panel while he planted knives inches from her body. Total trust, zero margin for error. This mode of transportation is called a litter, or sedan chair. It worked like this. The person sat in an enclosed chair and 2 or more carriers hoisted the entire thing onto their shoulders and walked. In Imperial China, it was a status symbol. The more carriers, the more important the passenger. The person inside practically never touched the ground, and the ones carrying spent the entire day supporting the weight of another human being on their backs, for a miserable wage. One person's comfort was another's sweat. Tsar Nicholas II of Russia appears seated during captivity, around 1917. Shortly before, he had commanded an enormous empire. After the revolution, he was forced to abdicate and lived under surveillance with his family. In photos from that period, he appears sawing wood and doing simple tasks to pass the time. The image sums up the fall of a monarch who went from the throne to the condition of prisoner. People in Pierrot-style costumes with white clothes, pointed hats, and motionless expressions before the camera. This type of costume was common at balls, theaters, and parties of the early 20th century. Today, the look may seem strange because of the black and white, the rigid poses, and the faces covered by makeup or masks. What was once entertainment and stage performance ended up gaining a mysterious air with the passage of time. October of 1945, a few weeks after the end of World War II. The scene is from Mongolia, a Soviet ally that had just entered the war against Japan. Horsemen in traditional garb stop before a parade float with a Soviet tank and a biplane on top. It is the contrast of 2 worlds in the same frame, of people who still traveled on horseback contemplating the machines of modern warfare. Soviet propaganda made a point of this, bringing the symbol of victory to the most remote corners of its sphere of influence. The construction of the Berlin Wall began in the early morning of August 13, 1961. and caught the city by surprise. Within hours, barbed wire cut through streets, neighborhoods, and families. Then came the concrete barriers, turning the wall into the greatest symbol of the Cold War. The image represents a division created not to prevent invasions, but to control its own population. Nikola Tesla appears, seated in his laboratory in Colorado Springs in 1899, while enormous electrical discharges seem to surge around him. The image is impressive, but was made with double exposure. First, they photographed the machine's discharges. Then, Tesla seated safely. The discharges were real, but the calm pose in the middle of them was staged. It was science, theater, and marketing in the same portrait. This man is Harvey Ball, the designer who created one of the most recognizable symbols on the planet, the yellow smiley face. In 1963, an American insurance company hired him to boost employee morale, and he sketched that face in under 10 minutes. He received $45. That was it. Ball never patented the design, and the smiley became billions in t-shirts, stickers, and later, the grandfather of the emoji. He earned the same $45 forever. He created a universal icon and never made another cent from it. On May 10, 1869, at Promontory Summit, Utah, the two ends of the first American transcontinental railroad finally met. To mark the occasion, they drove a spike of solid gold into the last tie. The photo of the two locomotives face to face with workers toasting became famous worldwide. The golden spike was, of course, pulled out right away and replaced by a regular iron one. Nobody was going to leave gold planted in the middle of the desert. The coast-to-coast journey, which used to take months, now took days. Opossums hanging from the front of a New York butcher shop around 1916. Strange today, but opossum meat was once a common dish in the United States, especially in the South and among the poorest. The butcher hung the animals in the window like any other merchandise, food for those who could not choose. Two young British soldiers appear on a train platform with bags and parcels in hand, ready to board during World War I. The station was often the last point of contact with home before the front. The expression on both faces mixes youth, anticipation, and uncertainty. The image does not need to show combat to convey the weight of that moment. 5 cents paid for a spot to sleep in this tenement on Bayard Street in New York in 1889. People piled on the floor, dozens in a single room. Jacob Riis's photographs shocked the elite so much that they helped change the city's housing laws. The construction of the Hoover Dam between 1931 and 1936, in the desert between Nevada and Arizona, was one of the greatest engineering projects in the United States. Thousands of men worked in extreme heat and difficult conditions. The volume of concrete was so vast, it had to be cooled with pipes of ice water. The work impresses by its size, its engineering, and the human effort involved. The young woman in the photo is Aloha Wanderwell, who between 1922 and 1927 became the first woman to drive around the world in an automobile. She was only 16 when she answered a newspaper ad, looking for someone for a global expedition, and dropped everything. She crossed dozens of countries in a Ford Model T, traversing deserts, getting stuck in mud, and fixing the car with mashed banana and grease when parts were missing. In an era when women could barely vote, she drove across the entire planet. Children playing in the streets, in a scene that seems simple but says a lot about urban childhood of another era. Without expensive toys, without screens, and without large play areas, the street became the meeting point. Branches, poles, sidewalks, and storefronts were part of the fun. The photos show a childhood that was freer and more improvised, but they also remind us that many of those children grew up in poor neighborhoods where playing in the street was more necessity than choice. The giant instrument in the photo is a massive harmonica called the Bluebird Superorgan. It was so large it required 2 people to play, one on each side, blowing and sliding together across dozens of holes. It was a novelty from the 1930s, the kind of thing that shows up in a music shop to draw attention and entertain. Playing a regular harmonica alone is already hard work. Imagine coordinating your breathing with another person on the same instrument without going out of tune. More than music, it was a balancing act and partnership. The 1920s were the era of aerial daredevils. In 1925, Gladys Roy and Ivan Unger appeared playing tennis on the wings of a biplane, in a scene created to grab public attention. Meanwhile, the Frenchman Charles Godefroy, in 1919, flew under the Arc de Triomphe in Paris as a symbolic protest. Those were times when aviation, spectacle, and daring went hand in hand. One of the first underwater portraits in the world, made in 1899 by the Frenchman Louis Boutin off the southern coast of France. Boutin practically invented underwater photography. He created waterproof cases for the camera and even a flash under the water. Every click at the bottom of the sea was improvised engineering. Tower Bridge took 8 years to complete, from 1886 to 1894, with more than 400 workers. What few people know is that the medieval castle look is a facade. Underneath the stone is a skeleton of more than 11,000 tons of steel. The stone was placed only to make the bridge look like the Tower of London right next to it, so it would not clash. In other words, one of the oldest postcards of London is, at its core, a modern industrial structure dressed in costume. Russian soldiers in the civil war that followed the revolution of 1917 and killed millions. On one side, the Red Army, on the other, the Whites, in the middle, a starving people. The mismatched uniforms tell the story. It was an improvised force, dressed in whatever was available. The image is sold as the Hungarian engineer Stefan Nailed and his machine to make things invisible from 1935. Be careful with the name. The man behind the famous invisibility rays of the era was Stephen Pribble, and this Stefan Nailed only exists in versions that circulate on the internet. The device even fooled newspapers, but it was nothing more than a trick of light. A famous photo from July of 1961 shows Disneyland employees eating lunch backstage. The character heads appear resting on the table, revealing the actors behind the costumes. Disney has always protected this illusion before the public, especially children. That is why the image draws so much attention. It shows the human break behind the enchanted kingdom. The future imagined by General Motors had an address, the New York World's Fair of 1939. There, GM built a giant attraction called Futurama, designed by Norman Bell Geddes. Visitors sat on a conveyor belt and flew over an enormous scale model of the world of 1960, with wide highways, skyscrapers, and cars everywhere. It was propaganda disguised as prophecy. GM was selling a future where the automobile reigned and the city revolved around highways. The disturbing part is that it worked. The world they designed in 1939 is more or less the one we built. Around 1946, Puerto Rican workers flew to the United States crammed into an adapted military plane on hard canvas seats. It was the Great Migration. Hundreds of thousands left the island in search of work. The cheap and uncomfortable flight was the price of a new life. The Empire State Building went up at a speed that would seem impossible today. From start to finish, just over a year, completed in 1931. The workers labored hanging hundreds of feet above the ground, without belts, without nets, eating lunch seated on steel beams with the entire city below them. The photographer Louis Hine climbed up with them to document everything, and was even hoisted in a bucket to photograph from outside. It was inaugurated in the middle of the Great Depression, and for years stood so empty they nicknamed it the Empty State Building. Ventriloquism is much older than the theater stage. The word comes from Latin and means something like speaking from the belly, because people used to believe the voice came from the stomach of the person doing the trick. In antiquity, it was a matter of religion. They thought ventriloquists spoke with the dead or predicted the future, and some were treated as prophets. Only much later did it become entertainment. Then came the wooden dummies, the silent partner who suddenly gains a voice. What was once considered a supernatural gift ended up in the ring, making audiences laugh. On April 18, 1946, a double-decker streetcar on Line 72 derailed in Woolwich, in southeast London, and toppled against the shops on the street, stopping at a jaw-dropping angle. Police and onlookers surrounded the scene while the vehicle dumped its entire weight onto the facades. Accidents like this helped seal the fate of streetcars. A few years later, London began retiring the entire system, replacing the tracks with the buses that dominate to this day. What seemed like the future of transportation became a museum piece before the middle of the century. A circus inside a children's hospital in 1923. Since many hospitalized children could not go to the show, performers brought clowns, acts, and animals to the ward. The scene shows an attempt to bring lightness to a difficult environment. For those patients, a few minutes of laughter and distraction could mean a great deal. Walter Yeo, a British sailor, had his face destroyed by burns in a naval battle in 1916. He became one of the first patients of advanced plastic surgery. The Dr. Harold Gillies created a skin graft that reconstructed his face and helped found modern reconstructive surgery. Fishermen and sailors faced one of the hardest jobs in coastal communities. They went out in small boats, often for days, braving cold, wind, and unstable seas. Every voyage demanded strength, experience, and courage. In the images, the faces and clothing tell the routine of those who depended on the ocean for a living. For these families, the sea was sustenance, but it also brought constant risk. In 1885, a Scottish doctor and writer named William Gordon Stables had a vehicle built that nobody had ever seen before. A house on wheels, pulled by horses, made solely for traveling for pleasure. He named it the Wanderer. It is considered the first recreational caravan in the world, the grandmother of all trailers and motorhomes. Stables traveled across Great Britain living inside it, and even wrote a book about the experience. He put on paper, without knowing it, the dream of freedom that would drive tourism a century later. The Kayan people of Southeast Asia are known for women who wear brass rings on their necks from childhood, sometimes adding up to more than 22 pounds of metal. Here is the detail almost everyone gets wrong. The neck does not stretch. The rings push the collarbone and ribs downward, creating the illusion of a long neck. Removing the rings after years does not kill the person, as the legend says, but it does leave the muscles weak and the neck sore. The tradition is ancient and still divides opinion. A symbol of identity for some, a forced tourist attraction for others. On October 22, 1895, at the Montparnasse station in Paris, a train arriving from Granville came in too fast and crashed through the safety barrier. The locomotive broke through the station wall and hung over the street, in a scene that became one of the most famous railway images in the world. Despite the dramatic impact, most passengers survived. The photograph became a symbol of an era when speed and machines still frightened cities. Children playing behind a water cart in the Poplar neighborhood of London around 1910. The cart sprayed water to settle the dust on the dirt roads, and the kids saw in it the best fun of the day. They ran behind to get sprayed for free in the summer. Poplar was one of the poorest and most overcrowded neighborhoods in London. For the children there, without toys and without parks, the street and whatever passed through it were the only playground available. A jet of water from a municipal cart was a celebration. A child appears next to the Krampus, a character from Alpine folklore. In the tradition, while St. Nicholas rewards well-behaved children, the Krampus represents the frightening side of winter festivities. Adults dressed in furs, horns, and chains to intimidate the little ones. Today the image seems dark, but it was part of a popular custom linked to Christmas in some regions of Europe. In 1931, a Welsh woman washes her husband's back after his shift in the mine. Mining houses had no bathroom, and the man came home black with dust from head to toe. Bathing him in the tub near the stove was part of the hard routine of every mining family. The Beliana was a type of Russian vessel that looks like something from another planet. It was so large. They were enormous wooden barges, some over 330 feet long, built to go down rivers loaded with lumber. And here is the twist. The vessel itself was the cargo. It did not come back. When it reached the destination, the Beliana was entirely dismantled and sold as lumber, plank by plank. They built a giant ship, knowing it would make only a single trip downriver before becoming raw material. A disposable vessel the size of a building. Before the refrigerator, ice was delivered house to house, and these two women are carrying enormous blocks with tongs. Heavy and nearly invisible labor, the kind the city only notices when it is missing. Women in overalls doing manual work shows the shift that the wars brought. The boy is Charles Highfield of Coventry, nicknamed Boy Samson, the strongest boy in the world. In 1932, at 14 years old, he appeared holding up a motorcycle weighing nearly 200 pounds with the rider on top. Real strength mixed with pure circus marketing. These men did not take Atabrine. The sign read, "At an American military hospital in Papua New Guinea." Atabrine blocked malaria but turned the skin yellow and sparked fears of impotence. Those who stopped taking it became targets of the disease, which killed more there than the enemy. French Guiana, the courtyard of the Cayenne Penitentiary. The photo records a capital execution at the most feared penal colony of the French Empire, the destination of many convicts, including prisoners sent to the Devil's Island area. The scene was carried out before other prisoners as a demonstration of authority. The conditions in Cayenne were already known for the harsh climate, the diseases, and the forced labor. A crowd in front of the stock exchange on Wall Street. Scenes like this marked the end of the 1920s. When the market crashed in 1929, fortunes evaporated overnight. Investors crowded the street, not knowing if they had lost everything. Many had. The Great Depression was beginning. The soup kitchen in the photo was set up with the support of Al Capone during the Great Depression around 1931. While thousands lost their jobs and faced hunger, the space served free meals. The gesture also helped improve Capone's public image at a time of legal pressure. That same year, he was arrested for tax evasion. The image mixes charity, propaganda, and organized crime. The mask on this woman was part of a beauty treatment from the 1940s. The coin-operated machine beside her applied diathermy, a method that heated the skin with electrical current and promised to improve the appearance of the face. Today, the look seems strange, but at the time it was presented as modern skincare technology. The giant statue of Tsar Alexander III stood before the Cathedral of Christ the Savior in Moscow. After the Russian Revolution, monuments linked to the old regime began to be removed as part of a new political message. In the images, the sculpture appears fallen and dismantled, surrounded by onlookers and workers. It was more than the removal of a work of art. It was an attempt to erase symbols of the imperial past and show that a new order had taken the place of the czars. The wedding of a blind World War I veteran in 1921. Many men returned from the front with physical injuries and deep emotional scars. For some, rebuilding a life, starting a family, and returning to routine was a quiet victory. The image shows that the end of the war on paper did not end its consequences in people's lives. In 1913, Thomas Edison poses beside a Detroit electric car. It sounds modern, but the electric car is ancient. At the beginning of the 20th century, it competed on equal terms with gasoline, and was even preferred for being quiet. Gasoline won for decades, and only now has the electric made its comeback. The letter bears the Apple computer letterhead and is dated May 11th, 1983. It is Steve Jobs' response to a fan who asked for an autograph, and the response is pure Jobs. He wrote, politely but directly, that he simply did not give autographs and returned the letter unsigned. And the irony is delicious. Precisely because he refused the autograph, that piece of paper became an extremely rare item. Decades later, documents signed by Jobs, or in this case unsigned, have been auctioned for tens of thousands of dollars. He refused the signature and accidentally created a relic. The old Cincinnati Public Library was breathtaking. Opened in 1874, it had a hall with 4 stories of cast iron shelving, spiral staircases, and a checkerboard floor, all beneath a giant skylight. It looked like a cathedral made of books. And here comes the painful part. In 1955, that magnificent building was demolished, and in its place came the usual, a parking lot and ordinary construction. Today, only photos prove that wonder ever existed. One of the most beautiful libraries the country ever had, simply wiped off the map. In 1957, in Australia, Christina Pawlowski reportedly shot an enormous saltwater crocodile near the Norman River in Queensland. The size attributed to the animal became legendary, but it also sparked debate, since the body was not preserved and the measurement could not be confirmed afterward. Whether exact truth or an exaggerated tale, the crocodile known as Chris entered Australian lore. In 1938, Westminster students were photographed walking through London in gas masks on their way to a chemical defense exam. World War II had not even started yet, but the trauma of poison gas from World War I was fresh, and England was already preparing for the worst. They distributed masks to the entire population, including children. Seeing boys in school uniforms with those things on their faces, on their way to take an exam, shows that the fear of war arrived before the bombs. Christmas of 1909 at Cook County Hospital in Chicago. Even in a public ward packed with poor patients, someone made sure to decorate everything for the occasion. For many patients there, far from family and without money, that simple decoration was the only Christmas they would have. This is not a montage or an internet joke. They really are British armored cars disguised as elephants in India during World War II. The vehicles were Lanchesters, covered by structures painted to look like elephants, complete with trunk and ears. Notice the wheels showing below the legs. The idea was to hide military equipment at a distance, making it pass for something ordinary in the landscape, since elephants drew no attention there. The armies of the war invested heavily in these visual tricks, and this was one of the most bizarre of all. That cabin on wheels is a bathing machine, an indispensable item on beaches in the 18th and 19th centuries. The modesty of the era did not allow men and women to be seen bathing together, much less in wet clothing. So the person entered the cabin fully dressed, was pulled by horses into the water, changed clothes inside, and descended directly into the sea, hidden from view. Some beaches even separated the hours for men and women. Going swimming became an operation full of rules to protect morality. One of the ancestors of the American food truck, probably a Ford Model T adapted to sell food on the street, food on wheels is much older than today's gourmet hamburger. As far back as the late 19th century, lunch wagons existed. Horse-drawn carts that served cheap meals to workers at hours when no restaurant was open. With the automobile, it was only a matter of time before someone put a kitchen on top of an engine. The trendy food truck merely reinvented an old wheel. A theatrical performance at the Glasgow School of Art in Scotland, around 1905. The school, designed by architect Charles Rennie Mackintosh, is one of the most celebrated buildings in British design. There, students did not just study art, they staged plays, designed costumes, and built sets as part of their training. An employee helps narcotics division detectives destroy seized substances in an incinerator. It was a way to show the public that confiscated material was being eliminated. The scene also served as police propaganda, recording the fight against crime in a simple and direct image. The interior of an old stable with lined-up stalls and a long corridor. On large estates, the stable was not just animal shelter. A horse was expensive property, a symbol of power. That is why many were built with the care of a church. The comfort of the animal measured the status of the owner. John Scopes appears in court during the famous monkey trial in 1925 in Tennessee. The teacher was accused of teaching the theory of evolution in the classroom, violating the state law of the time. The case became a national debate, broadcast on the radio and followed by crowds. More than a trial, the scene became a symbol of the conflict between science, religion, and education. Kate Ward, known as Camberley Kate, devoted her life to collecting stray dogs in England. From 1962 until her death in 1979, she cared for more than 600 abandoned dogs, taking the entire pack in a cart through the streets of the town of Camberley. She never refused an animal and never let one be put down. She lived off the little she earned selling postcards of herself with the dogs. She had no children, no family nearby. She had the animals nobody wanted, and they became the work of her life. The so-called curiosity shows were a major form of entertainment in the 19th century. People with rare conditions, physical differences, or unusual abilities were presented in circuses and fairs as paid attractions. For the audience, it was spectacle. For those on stage, the situation could mix opportunity, exposure, and necessity. Some gained fame and money, while others were treated merely as curiosities. These images recall an uncomfortable part of entertainment history. On May 24, 1987, the Golden Gate Bridge turned 50, and the city allowed pedestrians to cross the structure on foot. They expected a smaller crowd, but more than 300,000 people showed up. The weight temporarily flattened the bridge deck, alarming engineers on site. The structure held, and the celebration went down in history as an impressive and poorly calculated event. Workers appear high on the Eiffel Tower during construction between 1887 and 1889. The project involved hundreds of laborers at impressive heights, long before current safety standards. The result became one of the greatest symbols of Paris. What stands out is the contrast between the visual delicacy of the finished tower and the heavy, risky, and precise work needed to raise it. The Klondike Gold Rush began in 1896 and drew thousands of people to the Yukon Territory in Canada in search of wealth. The photos show men working in mining areas, surrounded by tools, mud, rocks, and physical effort. Behind the promise of gold was cold, hunger, exhaustion, and long workdays. Most returned with less than they expected. Few truly got rich. Many were left with nothing but the story of having tried. A durability test on an early automobile. At the dawn of the car, nobody trusted the machine, so manufacturers held public demonstrations to prove it could take it. They drove up staircases, crossed rivers, and drove for days nonstop. Selling cars in the beginning meant defeating distrust. An automated vertical parking garage by Westinghouse in Chicago around 1936. The idea seems modern, but it is old. Instead of the driver going up ramps looking for a spot, a mechanical structure lifted and stacked the cars in a narrow building, like books on a shelf. It saved space in a city where land was expensive and cars multiplied nonstop. Today, with cities choked, these elevator garages have come back into fashion in tight places like Tokyo. The futurism of the 1930s was too good, and the world took decades to rediscover it.